On this episode of WarDocs, we're honored to speak with retired Navy Captain Dr. Frank Butler. Dr. Butler shares his remarkable journey from serving as a Navy SEAL to becoming a prominent figure in military medicine, particularly in Tactical Combat Casualty Care. He discusses the evolution of medical practices in combat, the importance of continuous improvement, and the significant impact of his book, Tell Them Yourself, It's Not Your Day to Die. Frank emphasizes the critical role of combat medics, the lessons learned from historical battles, and the need for effective communication and training in military medicine. He also highlights the importance of initiatives like Stop the Bleed and the Hartford Consensus in enhancing survival rates during mass casualty events. For further information about Dr. Butler and our previous guests, visit our website at wardocspodcast.com. Be sure to follow WarDocs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our WarDocs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist.
Welcome to WarDocs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, WarDocs has you covered.
Today, we're privileged to welcome Navy SEAL and ophthalmologist, retired Captain Frank Butler to WarDocs. Frank, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about your pathway into military service first, and then ultimately, how did you wind up in military medicine?
Yes, so I was born in Savannah, Georgia, raised there, and went to Georgia Tech on a Navy ROTC scholarship. Went to Atlanta, did 4 years there, and met my wife there, a beautiful nurse. We've been married for 53 years now, 4 grown children and 14 grandchildren. But after Georgia Tech, I hopped in my car and went straight to Coronado, California, to Navy SEAL training. Didn't know anybody in the state of California. I had no plan B. I was completely dedicated to getting through SEAL training, as you have to be. That's not something you can go into half-hearted. I had a great 4 years in the SEAL community. Spent 2 years with Underwater Demolition Team 12 and 2 with SEAL Team 1. And then the Vietnam War was winding down. I just moved into medicine as sort of a natural next step. There was no one aha moment, but I come from a pretty medical family. We have 6 brothers and sisters, 3 nurses and 2 doctors. So I think it was there somehow in my childhood, but went straight from being a SEAL to Medical College of Georgia and did my 4 years there. And then family medicine internship in Jacksonville, and then 5 years in the Navy Experimental Diving Unit in Panama City, Florida, which was an amazing place. After the 5 years there, it was time to go and get a real job, and that was, for me, an ophthalmology residency. I went to Bethesda and did my 3 years of ophthalmology training there, and then came back to Naval Hospital Pensacola, expecting to be an eye surgeon for the rest of my professional career. But at that point, the admiral who was in charge of the Navy SEAL program decided that he wanted to have his own medical R&D program, one that was focused on the medical and physiology requirements of the Navy SEAL community, which are pretty broad. And he offered me a chance to do that, and I jumped at it. I did that for the next 14 years until I finally went down to the U.S. Special Operations Command to be the command surgeon.
So did you ever really get a chance to practice ophthalmology or?
Yes, for 14 years, I was here in Pensacola and running the Navy SEAL Medical R&D program, but also serving as the head of ophthalmology for the hospital here. So when I was in town, I was doing ophthalmology. When I was on the road, I was doing Navy medical R&D.
So now Obviously, eye injuries are a big part of trauma, but most folks don't naturally put an ophthalmologist with linking with tactical, you know, combat casualty care. How did you get involved in that TCCC, and how did your time in the SEAL community kind of impact that field broadly in military medicine?
Obviously, the Admiral didn't pick me to do the medical research program director job because I was an ophthalmologist. It was because I had been a SEAL, actually had worked for him in SEAL Team 1, and because I had done work that was very helpful to the SEALs during my time at the Experimental Diving Unit. He knew that I knew the SEAL community. He knew that I knew the research community, and figured I'd figure the rest of it out as I went along, which I did. And but it was a dream job. I had a very broad charter. I would go out and talk to the team commanding officers and find out what they needed, put together a list, come back and brief the Admiral. And if he gave it the green light, that's what we did for the next fiscal year. There were lots of different projects, some of which were very specific to SEAL operations, like diving medicine things. Others were like refractive surgery to be a SEAL. For a long time, if you'd had refractive surgery, you were out from the special warfare community. You could not apply and be accepted as a SEAL. And that might have been appropriate back when they were doing refractive surgery the old way. But when laser refractive surgery came along, it was a whole new ballgame. And so we did the necessary research to show that people could have that procedure and then go on and have a good career in the teams. And in fact, they have. It has been wonderfully successful. So Tactical Combat Casualty Care was one of many projects that we did, but it turned out to be the one that's certainly had the most impact for the DoD as a whole.
Well, that kind of leads me to, you're had a very impressive career with combat casualty care, and recently wrote a book. And you wrote the book with Kevin O'Connor and Jeff Butler, and it's entitled "Tell Them Yourself: It's Not Your Day to Die." Tell us about
Right.
your relationship with your co-authors. What inspired you to write this book, and what is the significance of that title?
Colonel, now retired Kevin O'Connor, when I met him, was the command surgeon for Special Forces Operating Detachment Delta in Fort Bragg, or simply Delta. And he had an interest in battlefield trauma care. So he wrote some early research papers, was one of the charter members of the committee on TC3. And his unit, Delta, was one of the first units to incorporate TC3 into their operating procedures. As you know now, he's President Biden's physician. He's been in the White House medical unit for 14 years now, I think, as a total. His involvement with TC3 preceded his time at the White House. And he helped to make a couple of very significant breakthroughs, one in battlefield pain management and one in prophylactic antibiotics. My son Jeff was a Navy SEAL for 4 years, then got out and went to join the CIA, where he was a case officer for 7 years. Now he is a battalion fire chief in Springfield, Missouri. And the interesting thing about Jeff's career is that every one of those very different locations, he's had to take TC3 training because at this point in time, all of those different outfits use TC3, including his fire department. None of us had ever written a book before. Jeff is a very accomplished writer. He writes for websites on political and military topics. And the title came from Kevin. We looked at a lot of titles, and most of them were, it's a medical book, so it's not the most exciting book to most people anyway. But Tell Them Yourself if you are out on a combat mission and somebody on the mission is hit with a gunshot, they're on the ground, the medic comes to take care of them, and the wounded person will often say, "Hey, doc, tell my family I love them." And the title is intended to pick up the significance of the combat medic saying, "Hey, you're going to be fine. I got this. You're going home. You can tell your family yourself that you love them." So kudos to Kevin for the title. People have liked it and responded very well to it.
So you begin the book with a chapter titled "A Day at the Office for a Combat Medic," and that describes the events that took place in October of 1993 from the perspective of Bob Mabry. And
Yeah.
this was the Battle of Mogadishu. How did that experience really influence the creation of the Committee of Tactical Combat Casualty Care? And what was the most significant lesson learned from that time?
So great question. It is interesting, the temporal association of Mogadishu and the start of the TC3 project. If you go back and recall the events of 3 October 1993, most of the units involved in Mogadishu were attached to Task Force Ranger, and those are Tier 1 Special Operations units, and pretty much everything they do is highly classified. So, the entire country obviously knew about the Battle of Mogadishu, but the names of the people that were wounded, what specific wounds that they had, what their outcomes were, that was all under lock and key. So I had no access to any of the casualty data from Mogadishu at the time we were working on TC3. Interestingly, when the book Black Hawk Down was written, and I don't know how Mark Bowden managed to get access to all of that information that we couldn't get access to. I guess, like most reporters, he's good at taking people out to bars and buying them drinks. But all of a sudden, we could see the names of the people that were injured and what they had. So in 1999, shortly after the book came out, we did a workshop on Mogadishu, and we actually had a lot of the participants who'd been in the battle, including Bob Mabry and John Holcomb, and Eric Olson, by the way, Navy SEAL, future admiral. And so we sat there and we just went through and talked about each of the casualties, what was done, what could have been done. So we did capture the lessons from Mogadishu after the fact, but we had no access to anything from Mogadishu at the time the TC3 project was being undertaken and before the first TC3 paper was written. So all that came after. But it was an amazing story. What lessons were learned? If you go back and you read some of the things that Bob Mabry has written about that battle after the fact, it talks about how he had a very heavy medical aid bag filled with the wrong equipment. We had not gone back and rethought our battlefield trauma care concepts in an organized fashion. So you're a urologist. You are familiar with the American College of Surgeons. If you go to take the ATLS course, you get the same ATLS course that all the civilian docs do, right?
Right.
And the same was true of special ops medics and special ops physicians. So we were trying to take a military square peg and fit it into, a civilian square peg and fit it into a military round hole. And it just didn't fit well.
Yeah, one of the things that really amazed me, and I didn't know about the story, was that the shark attack that had happened, the day before, and one of the surgeons was not there because they had to take that patient out. And was that
Right.
something that changed how, moving docs in or surgeons in and out of an area?
It forced them, they used up an ungodly amount of blood trying to save the life of that person who had been bitten by the shark. He ultimately wound up dying of his injuries, but they used a lot of the blood, and so they had to use a walking blood bank in Mogadishu, which was kind of a preview into the future. Walking blood banks were used extensively in Afghanistan and Iraq, but they weren't new to those conflicts. Yeah, I thought about including some of the pictures from the shark attack in the book, but decided that they didn't really add anything and they were a bit graphic.
One of the things that we wanted to capture at WarDocs is how, that term docs in the military setting doesn't just refer to physicians. And I love
Right,
how in the book you describe the combat medic doc as a unique amalgam of healer, caregiver, and warrior. How important
right.
is it for a unit to have trust in those medics who are at the tip of the spear, providing care to their buddies and those in need?
I give my son Jeff, who was a SEAL officer, credit for a lot of the writing in that chapter. He did a great job of capturing the very special position that combat medics have in their units. They are the healer, but they're also the person that is right next to them if there's a gunfight going on. So the role of combatant and healer are superimposed on each other. And that's a position that, I mean, trauma surgeons, emergency medicine docs, for the most part, do not go out and actually take part in combat actions. But combat medics very definitely do. And so they are a very trusted part of the team. And it is a position or a title of great honor to be called doc. And military medics love nothing better than to have that be the term that you call them by. And in sequence, it is quite an honor for a military medic to refer to one of the physicians that he works with as doc because of the special significance that that title has in military medicine.
Well, in the book, you emphasize that lessons learned aren't really lessons learned until you really learn the lesson. Can you share an example from combat medicine that took, a lesson that really took long to implement or solidify?
Sure, and there's a number of them, but let's think about two. One was tourniquets. Tourniquets, as you know, have been around for centuries. And yet, at the start of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, most American medics did not have tourniquets. Or if they did have tourniquets, they were tourniquets that didn't work. And in their battlefield trauma care course, they had been taught not to use them because the thinking was that, if you put a tourniquet on an arm or a leg, that you cut off the circulation to that arm or leg, and the individual, you might save his life, but at the expense of having to cut his leg off later because of the ischemia. And there's some stories. Are you a Stephen Ambrose fan at all?
I am.
There's a story that I remember from his book D-Day. He talks about one of the corpsmen on the USS Bayfield, a guy named Vincent Del Judas. And one of the patients that was brought in from the beachhead had stepped on a German mine and suffered terrible injuries to all four extremities. And the tactical situation was such that a German medic came upon him, and rather than shooting him, he actually put tourniquets on all four extremities and saved the American service member's life. That's the good news. The bad news is that the Germans soon had to withdraw. I mean, that's good news too. But when the Germans withdrew, they left the wounded person for our system to pick up and get back to the ship. So many hours passed before this wounded individual got back to the Bayfield. And when he got back, they found that his arms and legs had all been very badly damaged by ischemia, lack of blood flow. They had to amputate all four extremities. So things like that. the response, rather than thinking, is there a way that we can use these devices that's better, was more along the lines of just saying, let's don't take the risk, let's don't use the device. That's where we were in 1992. And we had started this project by then. And I'm an old runner who's beat my knees up for a lot of years, and I had to have knee surgery. I go into the operating room, and after they start the IV, the first thing they do is to put a tourniquet on my leg.
Right.
And I started to protest, and they just gave me some more happy juice, and I went back to sleep. But the next day, when I came in and talked to the orthopedic surgeon, I said, "Hey, Jeff, you put a tourniquet on my leg during the surgery." And he looks at me like, "Yeah." I said, "You know that we teach people not to do that on the battlefield because of the danger of having to amputate the extremity." And he said, "Frank, what can I tell you? I use tourniquets on my patients in the OR every day, and they do fine. Nobody has to have their leg cut off." And so all of a sudden you realize that there is a terrific disconnect in how we use tourniquets. And when you pull the thread on that, it was just solely a factor of time. Tourniquets are fine for an hour. They're not fine for 8 hours.
Right.
And we just had to figure that out and put it to work for us.
So one of the other things that I think is interesting in the book is that you touch on other things like tourniquets where medical practice are being walked back or rediscovered. What other things besides tourniquets did we forget about and then, quote unquote, rediscover that, hey, maybe this stuff does work?
Absolutely. Whole blood is the poster boy for that sort of a scenario. We discovered that whole blood was the best thing for combat casualties in World War I. And then we forgot it in the time period between World War I and World War II. And then we figured it out again in World War II. A surgeon named Pete Churchill was a driving force behind that. And it was a battle because in the interwar years, the military and much of the civilian sector had developed the thought that plasma was just as good as blood. And it's logistically much easier to get to soldiers in combat. So they were using plasma, and Churchill said, "Hey, no, we need to be using whole blood." And he was right, but the Army establishment was not receptive to this 06 coming in and telling Army medicine how to take care of combat casualties. So he sent the story to the New York Times. And as the book recounts, they published it. And all of a sudden, the whole blood showed up on the battlefield and was used very successfully throughout the rest of World War II. You would think, okay, well, we've invented it twice. We got it. We're not going to forget this anymore. Not true. We forgot it again after World War II. And when we went to war in Afghanistan, Bob Mabry, when he went into Mogadishu, was not carrying whole blood or plasma. He was carrying crystalloids, which, as you know, are basically, they're an electrolyte solution. It is the medical version of a sports drink. It's IV sports drink. It has no oxygen carrying capability. It does nothing to help your blood clot. In fact, just the opposite. So when we started the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, everybody was getting these electrolyte solutions that were causing them to have bleeding problems because we take your blood that has all of these clotting factors in it, and then we dilute those out with a crystalloid solution, which caused terrific coagulopathies, which increase mortality. So based on those observations, the historical knowledge of World War I and World War II, credit to the Army, the Institute of Surgical Research, the Joint Trauma System, there's an organization called THOR that you may be aware of. It's an international organization that helps to improve trauma resuscitation. Individuals like Phil Spinella and Geir Strandines. On our side, Holcomb and Andre Kapp, And they pushed hard, and they did the research. They didn't just say, we think this is what we need to do, so just make it happen. What they did was to make the change and then to observe the patients. So at the end of a period, they could look at individuals who had gotten whole blood and individuals who hadn't, and could see that the individuals who had gotten whole blood did better, just like World War I, just like World War II. So now we've invented this for the third time. And the question is whether or not we will remember it for the next war.
So I remember seeing a picture of, I think it was Jen Gurney and Stacy Shackelford standing underneath a sign that said Frank Butler Boulevard at FST facility near Mosul. And that really is a powerful testimony to your contributions to TCCC. From your perspective, how has TCCC evolved since its inception in 1996? And what specific challenges did you face implementing such sweeping changes and overcoming institutional resistance from the various agencies that had to adopt it?
Yeah, well, as you know, the original paper was written in 1996, and it changed almost everything about pre-hospital trauma care. At least it changed the recommendations. But the fact that you have a published research paper, of course, does not mean that the Army or the Navy or the Marines are going to adapt it or adopt it and take it to war with them. So in the years between 1996 and 2001, there was a lot of talking, presenting at conferences, going back and forth with trauma care experts, talking to unit medical officers like Kevin O'Connor and Colonel Russ Coatwall and the Rangers and many others, trying to make the case based on the evidence that was available at the time. But of course, there was not a war going on, so we didn't have any casualties coming in. There was nobody dying because they didn't get the proper care. And all that changed with 9/11. When we went to war in Afghanistan, the units in the U.S. military who had adopted TC3 were the SEALs, the 75th Ranger Regiment, Delta, the Air Force Pararescue Community Combat Controllers. So the special tactics teams that AFSOC had, those guys had also done it. They had leaders like Jim Bajan and Rob Allen who took a look at what the recommendations were, and they said, yeah, this makes sense. So after the war started in Afghanistan, what methodology did our military have to keep track of casualties and to identify whether or not they could have been saved?
Right, just probably the paper records.
Question for you.
Yeah, paper records and word of mouth almost.
Yeah. What about a trauma registry? There was none.
Right.
So in 2004, I went down to be the command surgeon at the U.S. Special Operations Command. And the first question I asked when I walked in the door was, how many people have we had killed in Afghanistan and Iraq that were special operators? And could their deaths have been prevented with better care? Nobody knew. By this point in time, John Holcomb and I had become good friends, and he had been made the trauma consultant for the Army Surgeon General and the commander of the Army Institute of Surgical Research. And so I called him and I said, John, we need you to do a study to look at all 82 of our fatalities and tell us what could we have done better to save these individuals. It was a little bit of a high-risk proposition in that when you do a preventable death analysis, if it turns out that the death was preventable, then in a way you are admitting fault,
Right.
So it was controversial at the Special Operations Command, but it was the right thing to do. You can't get better if you don't know what you did wrong. So Holcomb formed a team. He had Howard Champion, trauma surgeon from Washington, D.C., and we had tremendous help from Captain Jim Caruso, who was at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's office. So the Armed Force Medical Examiners, they were doing autopsies on all of our fatalities and still do, but they weren't doing preventable death analyses. And so Holcomb and Champion and Caruso and their team did exactly that. And so what we found was, of the 82 people that have been killed, 70 could not have been saved. Think of a helicopter hit in the air by a rocket and blows up midair. Everybody falls out of the sky. Those are completely non-preventable deaths. But what about a guy, and the picture is in the book, a special forces trooper that was shot about in his knee and bled to death. And you can see in the book where they tried to make makeshift tourniquets, and they put 3 makeshift tourniquets on, and they didn't work. If we had had an effective tourniquet, we would have been able to save 3 of those people. If we'd had a good, some places you can't put a tourniquet on, right? Like a neck wound or a pelvic wound, inguinal wound. And so for those places, you need hemostatic dressings. Hemostatic dressings would have saved probably 2 more of the individuals. But these are 5 of the best soldiers in the U.S. military, and we could have saved them, and we didn't. Then you have to ask yourself, what is the acceptable number of preventable deaths?
Right, 0.
That answer is pretty much 0, right? If you can save somebody's life, then you have a medical obligation to save their life. And so at the Special Operations Command, what that meant was taking these findings and bringing them to Vice Admiral Eric Olson and General Doug Brown and saying, sir, these are our guys. They died. They didn't have to die. We can do better. And we'll fix this problem if you support us with money to fund the training and the equipment to field all of the things that TC3 recommends. And that is how the TC3 Transition Initiative got started. And that helped to jumpstart TC3 and special operations. And then once all the guys out in the regular Army and the regular Marine Corps watched what special ops people were doing, they said, why are we not doing that? And pretty shortly thereafter, they were.
One of the other things that came out of that was the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care, and you were the chairman for a period of time. What does that committee do, and what do they continue to do in interwar periods?
Right. So in looking at the timeline, when the original paper came out, it was obvious that there were a lot of recommendations that had been made, but would likely change based on additional evidence in the future. So one of the recommendations in the paper was, we need a committee that's a standing committee that's comprised of trauma care experts and combat medics to sit down, sift through all the evidence that's out there, and update the recommendations as needed. So it's a great idea. It took us from 1996 to 2001 to find funding for that idea and to find a home for the Committee on TC3. It was interesting to me that, and a little disappointing, that a lot of organizations in the military did not want to have ownership of a committee that made updated battlefield trauma care recommendations. But the organization that finally did was the Navy Operational Medical Institute. Captain Doug Freer and Captain Steve Gibner were leaders there, and they said, yeah, this is a good idea. We're going to do this. Steve had been part of the TC3 effort back at the Naval Special Warfare Command when we had been working on the original project. So he knew all about it, was comfortable with the material. We provided research funding to get this going, and the Naval Operational Medicine Institute took it on as a new effort. It was started in 2001. We had our first meeting in 2002. We were at NOMI for 6 years or so before we went to the Defense Health Board, and were there for 5 years. And then once the Joint Trauma System was up and running, it became obvious that, hey, this is the DoD's lead agency for trauma care. This is where we should be housed. And with the help of people like General Doug Robb and Admiral Dave Smith and others, we made that shift. We went from NOMI to the Defense Health Board to the Joint Trauma System. And we've been there since 2013.
So another interesting thing about TCCC is that it's not been limited to the American military only. The foreign militaries and actually domestic first responders have adopted TC3 principles. What would you say is the most surprising or impactful outcome you've seen from its implementation outside the military?
People in the military feel a strong bond with tactical law enforcement, SWAT teams, police forces. It didn't take long for leaders and those groups to make the connection that, hey, these are trauma care guidelines developed for using when there might be somebody shooting at you while you're trying to take care of your patient. And so it's remarkable that in a handful of cities all over the country, people in law enforcement, tactical law enforcement, started to implement TC3. For example, Lieutenant Ralph Cruz led the effort for the Chicago Police Department. That was about 2008. And now, all these years later, they have hundreds of tourniquet applications by the Chicago Police Department, even more by Chicago Fire. And it's important because it saves the lives of wounded officers, but also wounded citizens or even suspects. It helps them to take care of their wounded fellow officers, but it's also so important because it shows the community that these individuals do more than just enforce the law. They help take care of you if you're injured, and they have the capability to do that. So Mike Mioli, a former SEAL in San Diego, Ray Casillas, a SWAT firefighter, paramedic in Los Angeles, multiple places around the country. And I've detailed them in the book. And some of these people have had tremendous stories of deputies and individuals that were saved over the years in all of these cities that have nothing to do with the military. These are law enforcement officers. That's been a great thing, and it's great to be able to help our law enforcement community like that.
You know, the book also discusses the importance of continually improving medical processes for the benefit of the patient, of the benefit of the person who's injured, rather
Right.
than making it easier or more convenient for the practitioner, whoever's providing care.
Right.
How do you balance the needs of both of those in high pressure environments like combat?
You know, there's a chapter in the book called The Tactical Advantage. You know, I guess it's not about convenience. It's more about the fact that if you are on a SEAL mission and you're in the middle of a gunfight, you don't stop and take care of your injured possibly until you have won the gunfight. Because if you don't win the gunfight, you don't get to take care of anybody possibly. By placing medical care in the proper tactical context, that is something that TC3 has done that has undoubtedly had a profound impact on many, many missions all over the world. And yet, you don't often hear about them because military organizations a lot of times don't come back and provide those tactical details to media people. But there is a really instructive story in there. Colonel Butch Anderson was a former special forces operator who became a physician and was in Iraq in a convoy. Their convoy was going under an overpass, and a sniper hit a number of the people, and there were two vehicles, and the sniper hit people in both vehicles. Colonel Anderson was hit. He was one of those wounded, and the team leader was in the vehicle in front of him. So conventional medical approach is, well, you stop, you get your wounded people out, and you put them down on the ground, and you put them in the supine patient position. You do a primary and secondary survey and see how they're doing. Well, don't forget there's still a guy up there with a weapon on the overpass that's looking to kill all of you. And so what Colonel Anderson did was to get out, not treat himself or the other wounded person. His first action was to eliminate the threat. And after the threat was eliminated, and very bad luck for this sniper to shoot a former Green Beret when as his target. Not sure whether or not Colonel Anderson actually killed the sniper, but for sure he wasn't around for very long. And then he went back and started treating the injured in the convoy. If he had not taken his actions in that sequence of steps, if he'd tried to be a doctor first and soldier later, he'd be dead, and probably several other people in the convoy would as well. So the tactical advantage.
Another thing that the book doesn't really shy away from is exposing some of the failures within TCCC practices. Can you elaborate on one of the failings of TCC that the book talks about and how that failure ultimately led to improved care?
Yeah, one of the things that we've learned from the joint trauma system, so that this was something that John Holcomb helped to get started. Its first couple of directors were Colonel Don Jenkins, Colonel Brian Eastridge, just giants of military medicine. And they put together a system that functions so well. Every Thursday, we talk about all of the casualties from both theaters all over the world, really, on the Thursday trauma conference. As we go over the care that was provided, typically the person who provided the care will be on the call, along with about 200 other people. And so if there's part of the care that could have been improved, you don't identify it in that setting as a failing. What you do is to say, what could we have done better? What is our opportunity to improve? And by looking at things like that, it helps to reduce the negativity. I mean, whoever was tied to the action and has responsibility for an observed adverse outcome, they feel plenty bad on their own without having 200 people there as they get their nose rubbed in it. It's an opportunity to improve. If one practitioner made that mistake, it's likely that other practitioners or other medics, other surgeons might have made the same mistake in the same setting. So we look at it from a systems approach. The example that stands out in my mind, and this was before the Joint Trauma System, it was before the Committee on TC3, but it talks about the Special Ops Medical Association conference. Early in the war, before there were any papers describing how TC3 performed in combat, our best sources of intel were combat medics. So we would talk to Rangers, we'd talk to Green Berets, we'd talk to SEALs who came back from combat and say, tell us about what you did for your casualties. Did it work? Did you use tourniquets? Were they effective? Did the leg have to be amputated? One of the cases that was presented in 2002 or 2003 was presented by an Army doctor named Cliff Clunan. He also was a former Special Forces. He was a medic. And he presented two Marine Corps casualties. One casualty had been shot in the face and had injury to his jaw, maxillofacial region, lots of bleeding. And so you think, well, this is a guy who's going to choke on his own blood or other parts of his anatomy that have been displaced by the wound. But that's not what happened. What happened is the casualty on his own assumed a sit up and lean forward position and let gravity and the act of spitting take all of the blood and tissue out of his airway. And the casualty survived. He presented a second casualty, also a Marine, also shot in the face, who was maintaining his own airway by sitting up and leaning forward. And they forced him into the patient position. And in the patient position, when you're supine, your face is up. If you have an injury to your mouth or face, it's all draining into your airway. And that individual did not survive. And it was due to his airway difficulty. That is a pretty dramatic lesson. And it didn't take but one observed event like that for us to go back and change the TC3 guidelines. We had not addressed the shot in the face but still conscious patient in the original guidelines. We should have. And that was not a failing, but an oversight, which we quickly corrected after Colonel Clunan pointed out that remarkable casualty. And, God bless the guy who didn't make it, but his death has saved dozens of other lives because now we know what to do.
One of the other impacts that you've had is you were a founding member of the Hartford Consensus to enhance survival in mass cal events and a key figure behind Stop the Bleed. Tell us a little bit about that program and the impact it's had worldwide.
Yeah, so one of the things that the book talks about is that, first of all, advances are not inevitable. We think that with modern science and as smart as we are with our artificial intelligence that, advances are inevitable. But think of the fact that we actually put a man on the moon before we figured out it would be a good idea to put wheels on suitcases. It was there all along.
Right.
And yet, despite we had a country of 200 million smart people, nobody thought of it until 1971. So there are some things that were just not observed. There are others, and the Stop the Bleed program, for change to happen, there really has to be somebody who is an advocate, somebody who says, I'm going to take this issue on and I am going to help drive this change. And I'm going to convince the people that need convincing. I'm going to show them the evidence that they need to see. And the person who was that leader for the Hartford Consensus was Linworth Jacobs, who was a very senior person in the American College of Surgeons. He was asked by the governor of Connecticut to come and help look at the poor kids who were shot at the Sandy Hook school shooting, to make recommendations on how to improve survivability in future mass casualty events. And one of the things that came out of that discussion was by 2008, essentially everybody in the U.S. military had tourniquets and was prepared and trained to use them when they went into combat. There was a paper that was published about, I think it was the same year as the Hartford Consensus, that went and looked at the pre-hospital data from the civilian sector. And they recorded several million activations. And out of those several million activations, how many instances of tourniquet application do you think were entered into the database?
0.
Exactly 0. So that's for 2008 and 2009, at a time when it was a change that was no longer questioned in the military. It was a standard. So why the gap? And I think the answer is because there is a progression of trauma care from the military to the civilian in wartime and from the civilian to the military in peacetime. But there's got to be somebody responsible. There's got to be a leader. And Linworth Jacobs was that leader. He mobilized the American College of Surgeons, and then the White House got involved. Dr. Kathy Brinsfield and Dr. Rick Hunt, when they were the policy people on the White House staff, that union of two different groups really helped to bridge the gap. All of a sudden, tourniquets are widely used in the civilian sector. I mean, just in the last couple of months, we've had 2 lives saved here in Pensacola with tourniquets, whereas before they might well have died. One was a shark attack victim, and the other was in a commercial accident. But tourniquets are now well accepted, and yet in 1992 they were absolutely forbidden.
Right.
And the other group that really deserves a shout out is it's great to have a program like Stop the Bleed, but you've got to have an organization that takes it upon themselves to go out and train it. And that has been both the American College of Surgeons and the National Association of EMTs. They've taken a leadership role, and they've said, hey, we're going to go out and do this. And they have trained people all over the country. The NAEMT has trained people in both TC3 and Stop the Bleed all over the world. It's an interesting observation that some organizations want just Stop the Bleed, just tourniquets, just hemostatic dressings. Others want TC3 as a whole package. And that, of course, is much more than just tourniquets and combat gauze.
Now, with your extensive experience as command surgeon of U.S. Special Operations Command and other significant leadership roles, how has your perspective on the role of military medicine evolved over the years? And what advice would you give to current and future medical professionals in the armed forces who aspire to make a lasting contribution?
2 things. One is that when I was hired by Admiral Worthington and Navy, the person who was a deputy at the Special Warfare Command at the time, Captain Tom Lawson, they basically gave me a broad charter. They said, go out and find the things that need to be done and then do them. And I came across a quote in a biography of Admiral William Halsey, and that was actually his quoted advice to one of his new staff officers who said, sir, what should I do? And the Admiral looked at him and said, look around, see what needs to be done, then do it. And that's good advice. And I think that in any organization, and I'm thinking of my time at Naval Hospital Pensacola, there are a million little things that you look at and think, that's not good. It could be done a lot better. But if you spend your time chasing all of those minor things, you won't be able to focus on your main job at the hospital. So I'd say pick your battles. Look around, see what needs to be done, find the 1 or 2 things that matter the most to you, and then go after those, but go after them hard. With respect to military medicine, I'm struck by the fact that every service member in the U.S. military counts on military medicine. They put their lives at risk. They do these incredible feats of airmanship and infantry combat. But the one thing that they are trusting military medicine to do superbly well is to take care of them if they get wounded in combat. And so that's a trust that we have to live up to all the time. And the TC3 community and our combat trauma surgeons and emergency medical docs that are involved with the Joint Trauma System, that is our goal, to ensure that trauma care is as good as it can possibly be so that we can bring our young men and women home alive if they're wounded.
In the last chapter of your book, there are several recommendations for the future. In your opinion, how can we ensure that the lessons documented and recommendations in Tell Them Yourself continue to influence the future generations of medical practitioners, both in the military and the civilian sector?
Yeah. Well, the optimist in me says, hey, TC3 is now known so widely and has been so well documented in so many different papers and proven to save lives over and over again, that it can never be lost. The realist in me says, hey, it could easily be lost. The war is over. You go back to peacetime priorities. We don't have people who are getting shot and have to be taken care of fighting our country's battles. And so priorities shift. Will the Joint Trauma System survive? Will the Committee on TC3s survive? I don't know. They've done a great job. They met a very great need at one point in time, but somebody down the road may say, oh, that's too expensive and there's no wars going on. We can probably do without a committee on TC3. We can maybe do without a joint trauma system. But the thing, I actually have 8 specific things. And after talking to literally dozens of people and letting them critique that list, number 1 on the list is the person who owns the enterprise in a combat unit is the combat commander. So the first person ever to write a letter saying that in my organization, we are going to practice tactical combat casualty care. That is our standard for the battlefield. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a nurse. It was SEAL Admiral Tom Richards. The lesson from that, it's a wonderful tribute to him that he was willing to trust his medical staff that much and pay that much attention to a very long and detailed medical brief. But for doctors to do as good a job as they can, and medics for our wounded troops, the line commander has to be exquisitely well engaged. The SEALs have done it, but maybe even better, the Ranger Regiment. The 75th Ranger Regiment, everybody knows Stan McChrystal, right? General McChrystal was the first person to say, we're going to do this. The whole regiment is going to do it. And not only that, but it's one of my big 5. If you can't do TC3 well, then you're not going to be wearing your Ranger tab for much longer. So ownership, the combat commander has to own medical care as part of being a good combat unit. The second indispensable element is that everybody who is killed in combat, we have to know why they died, and we have to know what we could have done better to keep them from dying. At this point in time, between the Joint Trauma System and the leaders at the Armed Forces Medical Examiners Unit, we do that, but we don't do it as well as we could. And I say that because the leaders at the Joint Trauma System, the trauma surgeons, and the leaders at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, the forensic pathologists, get together and decide whether or not a casualty's or a fatality's wounds could have been survived. I mean, if somebody's shot through the head, the answer is no. If they're traumatically dismembered, the answer is no. If they're shot in the knee and they bleed to death from that wound, the answer is yes, they could have been saved. The one disconnect that we still have with that process is the Joint Trauma System should be going to the line commanders and saying, you, Ranger Battalion Commander, this is why your Ranger died, and this is what could have been done better. We're not finding fault. We're not saying that your Ranger medic was not well trained. In fact, if he was a Ranger medic, he absolutely was well trained, but maybe he didn't have the right tools. Maybe the tourniquet was faulty. We have to know why every preventable death was not prevented. When we can tell that to the unit commanders, people like McChrystal and people like Tom Richards and Eric Olson and Bill McRaven, they will take that and they will make the leadership changes that need to be made. But if we don't provide them that feedback, they have no way of knowing.
So how can our listeners get a copy of the book, and how can they stay connected with the latest in TCCC?
The book is available through the Breakaway Media website. The other option is Amazon. Amazon carries the book, and a lot of people are more familiar with that, but you can get it from either of those two venues, if you go through and search deployed medicine on Google, that will bring up the Joint Trauma Systems website for TC3, Deployed Medicine. That's the name of it. And it'll have the latest guidelines. It'll have the latest instructional materials. It has terrific instructional aids for combat medics and for training combat medics. What it doesn't have, and what the book provides, is a historical account. If you get on the website, you can say, okay, in the here and now, this is what TC3 recommends. But how did we get there?
Right.
And that's important to know.
We've been speaking with retired Navy Captain Dr. Frank Butler on WarDocs podcast. Frank, thanks again for sharing your experiences and your insights with us, and thank you for your service to the nation. And we wish you the very best with the book, and I'll do what I can to get that opportunity for our listeners to get a copy of it and stay in touch with TCCC. Thanks.
Thank you so much for helping to spotlight the incredible successes that the military and the Joint Trauma System and Special Operations have made in taking care of our wounded warriors on the battlefield. Your message is part of making sure that we don't lose the successes from our previous conflicts before we find ourselves in our next conflict, God forbid. But your messaging is so important, and thank you for what you do as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to WarDocs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. WarDocs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts, and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team WarDocs on WarDocsPodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, WarDocs has you covered. Spread the word.